Hi, Butch.
Hey, Hamish, how are you doing?
Doing good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just sitting here in my home studio in Los Angeles, enjoying a third cup of coffee.
Great. I thought a good way to kind of get into some of your techniques would be to talk about how you approach recording different instruments. So I know you're a drummer yourself. Does that kind of change your approach to recording drums?
As a producer, I think being a drummer has been immense help to me because I've always been aware of, one, the groove, how a track feels, and also just looking at the overall arrangement. I think sometimes if you're just the lead singer or the lead guitar player, maybe sounds like a bit of a stereotype, but maybe you're not so aware of everything else that's going on in a song or in a track. It's been immensely helpful to me to have been a drummer. If you've ever seen me play, too, I'm not very flamboyant. I pretty much stick to pretty simple grooves and play parts when they're necessary, like fills and things, to get into bridges or choruses, and really sort of play to support the song. And so it's not that different than how I would approach telling what a drummer to do if I was producing him. They're kind of the same thing in some ways.
Do you have any go-to techniques for recording drums in terms of mics and techniques and things kind of over time? And I'm sure it varies depending on the project, but...
Yeah, when I'm starting a project, if it's a band, I like to go see them play live and get a sense of how their dynamic is and how they interact together and just sort of what technical ability and level each musician is at. And whether it's seeing a proper gig or a rehearsal studio, gigs are always better when you're in front of a crowd. I think it's, you're more open as an artist. More transparent, and it's good for me to sort of just get an idea what how everybody in the band plays and how they sort of glue together, and then I just adjust it. If it's a rock band and it's noisy, I'm probably going to use microphones and things that are a little bit more controlled. If it's more sort of mellow and open and jazzy or quiet, I can use more condenser microphones, large diaphragm microphones, and move it farther away from the drums and go for more of a room sound and space. Sometimes it depends on the song. If a song is really fast and there's a lot of fills and cymbals and stuff, then I feel like I need to get pretty tight on the recording of all the different drums and cymbals, just so I can really sort of control them in the mix.
Has your approach to doing it changed much since kind of the Smart Studios days in the 80s?
Well, it's funny, when I started listening to records as a producer, it was really in the late 70s, early 80s, particularly when I started listening to punk and new wave, because I felt a kinship to those bands. When I was growing up and my mom played me the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, and they were rock icons and untouchable. They were like gods on a different planet or something. And all of a sudden, punk rock and new wave made me realize, well, they're doing the same thing I'm doing in my band, and that's one of the reasons I really fell into producing. Is I felt like if they can make records that sound like this, I can do that too, or at least I want to attempt to try and do that. So it's it's interesting because there's sort of a simpler attitude to punk rock than there is to a band like who's a good prog band, a Genesis. I've seen Phil Collins play, and he's incredible. But I also saw the Ramones play, and they were incredible in a different way. And those are obviously two completely different approaches to recording drums and recording bands, and they're both valid in their own way.
I wanted to ask a little bit about kind of how your approach changes in terms of rooms as well. So, to use one example, obviously you did different versions of Nevermind at Smart Studios and at Sound City. How did your approach to recording Dave's drums differ in your different studios?
Well, I guess when I first started out, as much as I read up on how to record drums, and I tried to find as much information as I could when I started out engineering and producing. And this is before the internet. Now anybody can go on YouTube and you can look at a tutorial on how to record drums, and there's a lot of different ways to do it and different opinions. But back then, I just had to sort of figure it out. And when we started at Smart Studios, we had a really crappy mic selection. Mostly we had like Shure SM57s and 58s. We had a couple Sennheiser 421s. I think we had a couple AKG 451s. And then later got a couple 414s. As the studio got better and we got more work, we continued to buy microphones. But it wasn't, we started the studio in 1984, and I guess I didn't do Nirvana till 91. That's when I met Dave, Dave Grohl. And, so we went to Sound City, and they had three things. They had a great live room. It just sounded amazing to put anything in there, whether it was drums or guitars or bass or vocals. And they also had this incredible Neve console. But they also had a really good mic collection. They had a lot of tube mics and, some Telefunkens. And, when I recorded them, I think I kept a fairly simple setup. I'm pretty sure I put a 57 on top of the snare. I might have put a 451 on the bottom of the snare. I think I used 414s for overheads, much like I did at Smart. And I think I used 421s on the toms, much like I did at Smart. But I did put up a couple U87s in the room. And those also, just because the room sounded so good, they were kind of bulletproof. You just basically bring the mics up in the mix a little bit, and it just makes the drum sound amazing. The other thing I did, though, is I used an extension that I had been doing at Smart, where you take another bass drum and you take the front head off of the bass drum, then you add another bass drum to it, and you sort of put some like packing blankets and things and tape it on there. So basically you're extending the bass drum so it's longer. It's called a drum tunnel. And then you can put an ambient mic farther away from the kick to get more sort of whoomp out of it. And I think I used two mics. I probably used maybe a D12 or 421 for the close inside kick mic, and I think I used a Neumann FET 47 that was maybe about 6 or 7 feet away in the drum tunnel to get some of the whoomp on the kick drum. But a lot of that sound is Dave Grohl's playing too. I mean, if you put any other drummer on that drum kit, or like if I got on there and played, it wouldn't sound the same, And that's part of the nature of drummers too. They all have a complete sort of unique personality when they step behind the drums, and that's what makes it fun to record.
Was that drum tunnel something that you'd learned from someone else, or something that you kind of came up with through experimenting?
It was something that we had at Smart Studios, and when I went out to record in Los Angeles, we used a drum company that had some extra drums for rentals. I didn't know what Dave was bringing in to record with, so we rented some extra snares. One of the snares they had, by the way, was a bell brass called the Terminator, which that's what we used on the record. It just had an amazingly powerful sound to it. But that was something I had been doing at Smart beforehand, and I think the drum company that we rented some extra drums from, they had something like that. I said, do you have anything like a drum tunnel or something to extend the kick drum? They said, yeah, I can bring something in. So the other thing that we invented at Smart, I guess maybe invented is not the right word. So many punk bands came in, and the drummers were not very good. They played really fast, like sped up polka beats, and they would barely tap the snare, and they would hit the hi-hat really loud. So it was always like shh, all the way through the song. So I took a couple pizza boxes, because we ate a lot of pizza late night at the studio, takeout pizza. And I cut a V slot in both sides and holes on the top and the bottom I punched through, so you could slip it over the hi-hat stand and put one in the bottom below the hi-hat cymbal, and then put the top hi-hat cymbal on, and then you'd put the top pizza box through the hole through the stand, and they would come down, and you could Velcro them together. And then I could slide it around so it's like a cutout pizza section of V, where the drummer could play the hi-hat. And it freaked out a lot of drummers. I would look at his playing or her playing, and I would move it around so there was a spot where they could totally hit the hi-hat fine. And at first they'd all like, oh man, I can't play with this. And I go, yeah, you can. Just close your eyes and play. You're not going to hit the hi-hat on the backside of it, or on, there's a certain area where you're going to hit it. And it was amazing because it took the sound of the hi-hat down in the overheads and the rest of the drum mics by probably 60 or 70%. So it just cleaned up the drums immensely. And we used that for about 2 to 3 years at the studio, and then someone stole it. And I remember being really pissed off about that, but it's like it was one of those things that it took me a while to figure out how to build, and I was like, I got to make another one of this, and I never got around to making another one, but it worked great when we actually had it at the studio.
I guess moving on to electric guitar, you obviously worked on a lot of albums that are very famous for their electric guitar sounds. I guess in terms of layering electric guitars, obviously Billy Corgan did that a lot, and you did that a lot with Nirvana. Did you have any techniques for kind of recording and mixing a lot of guitars in the same track to make them kind of blend together?
Well, if you're going to record a lot of guitars and you're going to use them in the mix, layer them, you have to be very careful about how the different tones match up. And there's a lot of trial and error with that. Like you may start with a big sort of fuzzy tone, like a Telecaster or a Les Paul, into a Marshall or something that has a pretty thick tone. And then if you're going to put cleaner sounds on or even more fuzzy sounds, sometimes you need to change the guitar, change the amp. A lot of times I would change the mic to get different sort of tonal sounds that would work together. When I was doing the Pumpkins, we usually had a speaker cabinet set in the middle of the studio that we could plug any head into. A variety of different heads we would use, and I had 4 different mics set up at all times on the cabinet. I think I probably had a U67, a ribbon mic like a Royer, or it might have been back then, I don't even know if they had Royers then, probably a Beyer ribbon mic, which are also great ribbon mics on guitars. Maybe a 57 or a 421, and then it's like another large diaphragm, maybe a U87 or I can't remember, but. And then they would go to different preamps in the studio, and so I could EQ those all differently if I wanted to. Sometimes I would run them through the Neve console. Sometimes I'd go through an API lunchbox. I love API preamps and EQs on guitars because they're very they're kind of more aggressive. They're not as soft as Neve, and you can really pinpoint frequencies. Most of the time when you use those APIs, you have to boost at least 2 dB or cut 2 dB. You can't do a half dB or 1 dB. So when you start EQing them, you hear them right away, and that's a really good thing. But one of the things I found is rather than boosting, if you're starting to layer guitars, rather than boosting EQ, is to cut frequencies. If there's a particularly bitey frequency in the 1 to 3K or 1 to 4K, maybe you just want to focus that on one of the guitars and cut that like by 5 or 6, 7 dB on the other guitar, and you can bring it up, because sometimes if you start to get too much of that same frequency, it can just really mess up the track, mess up your mix. So a lot of it is trial and error. There's no, I couldn't just tell you, you can do this and do that. You have to use your ears and listen to how they all are starting to sound together. And then the same in the mixing. A lot of times I find that when I filter guitars. Like whatever the main guitar is, I usually leave most of the bottom and the top in that. But if there's extra guitars in there, it doesn't necessarily need to have low end extending all the way down to below 50 hertz. You can cut it at 150 hertz. That cleans up the bottom end as you start stacking tracks. And the same with the top end. You don't necessarily need everything, all the sort of rizzy overtones, from like 6K on above. It's sort of trial and error, but I'll filter a lot of them, and then so you can put them in together. You want to actually be able to hear them too. You don't want it to turn into just like one gigantic frequency. And so it's trial and error, but I think by using different guitars and different amps and changing your mics up, and then actually EQing and filtering in the mix process, you can put a lot of guitars together and get a real symphonic sound.
If you were compressing the guitars, would you generally do them individually or kind of all together as a bus?
A lot of times I'll run the guitars to a separate bus, a stereo bus. Usually when it comes to mix, I have, like 4 or 5 different sort of stereo buses. There'll be drums, and then maybe another hyped drum stereo bus that's like super EQ'd and compressed that I can bring up, like a parallel compression thing. I usually put the bass on a separate submix, and then all the guitars go to one, and usually if there's keyboards, all the keys go to one, and then all the vocals go to one. So I usually end up with like 5 different buses that I bring up, submixes that I bring up that go to the final master bus.
Is the master bus then pretty minimal, or are you doing a lot there as well?
I've never been a big master bus process guy. I know a lot of people are. Sometimes I'll put a little bit of limiting on there or a little bit of compression. I like to do that, EQ and compression on individual channels, and then on the submixes, I'll limit the drums and limit the bass or whatever. But when it finally gets to the master bus, I've never been a huge guy to crush the mix. Sometimes when I was mixing, I would do 2 mixes. I would mix one that I knew was going to be sent off to the mastering engineer, and then I would do a separate mix, and I would compress the shit out of it, call it the hype mix, to be able to play for people. So if they came into the studio, whether it was the band or the record company or somebody, so they could hear it, what it was going to sound like more when it was mastered. But that's not the one that I sent to the mastering engineer. I would always send the uncompressed, unhyped master bus mix to the mastering engineer, so they had a lot more control in the mastering. And I know a lot of people really like to use a lot of things on the bus. As I'm sitting here in front of my Pro Tools rig, I do have, on my bus here, sometimes mixing, I do have a couple plug-in things that I use to hype up a mix. But it depends on the music. Sometimes I just want to have a little bit of a gain compressor to make it, sonically, in terms of loudness, a little more competitive with everything that's out there. But I try not to go too far with it because, if you print mixes that way, you can't really undo it.
And another band you've worked with who are well known for kind of guitar sounds is obviously Sonic Youth. Were there any experimental techniques that were used on that album, especially because I know they're obviously big on experimental techniques as a band?
Well, the most interesting thing about Sonic Youth is how they tune their guitars. That's a big, big part of the sound. When I first met them, went to the rehearsal studio and I looked at all the guitars they had. And Thurston back then used to play a lot of Fender Jazz Masters, and on the back of each headstock, they'd have the tuning, and I'd look at a guitar and it would be F sharp, F sharp, F sharp, D, D, F sharp. The next one would be E flat, D, E flat, G, G, A, like really tunings. I'd pick it up and strum it, and they just sounded terrible. They were, if you just played it with open strings. And but that's how both Lee and Thurston approached it, is using a lot of different tunings to get some dissonance and ringing strings that would ring in tandem to get extra harmonics, and And that was a lot of their sound. You know, they had some stomp box pedals, and I tried not to do too much processing when I recorded them. You know, I would pick different mics. You know, I might use a condenser or a ribbon mic or a dynamic mic. But the main thing was I wanted to stand in front of the amp and see what it sounded like, and I tried to capture that fairly au naturel. You know, I didn't want to sort of change the sounds that they had coming. And there was obviously some compression and EQ and things like that in the mix, and sometimes I'd add some effects, some extra delay or reverb. But for the most part, I was very keen on capturing their sound.
Talking about unusual techniques as well, with your own band Garbage, when you're producing kind of albums or working on albums with them, do you kind of see it as like an opportunity to try out weird things that you've been thinking about or unusual things, or is it more of a kind of you just want to think about the music and get on with it kind of as simply as possible?
Well, in Garbage, we've always been lab rat experimenters, Duke and Steve and I, and we love doing that. I love doing that still. As I'm sitting here in my studio, there's all these stomp box pedals on the floor in front of me, and but I'm actually using them. I'm running drums through them, but it's been part of what drives us as a band. You know, obviously we like to write songs that we think resonate sort of emotionally with people. But a lot of that comes to Shirley singing in her lyrics, but. You know, we like to muck around with coming up with crazy sounds, whether it's on a guitar or keyboard or a drum loop. And there's always some noisy things in the tracks that we do. And it's funny, we're not real clinical about it. We can be pretty quick and experimental. We'll just start plugging things in when we're working on a guitar part. And if it sounds cool, just go, that's fine. Let's just do some takes, play the part you're going to play. And once we have a song, we usually record it pretty quick, and then I'll take that and chop it up and manipulate it even more in Pro Tools, whether it's cutting it up or filtering it or adding, strange ambience to it or running it backwards or layering it with other sounds. It's just part of who we are as a band in Garbage. That's part of our DNA, but it's part of our process, and I have to say that's what makes the recording really interesting, because if it was predictable, it wouldn't be that interesting for any of us. So I think we enjoy those lab rat days.
Was that kind of process influenced by your time previously in the studio and thinking that you'd want to work on your own creative things in the same way?
It was. I mean, I think anybody I've worked with, whether it was Nirvana or working with the Pumpkins, Billy Corgan, he was a real gearhead. The sounds that we got on Siamese Dream were, we worked really hard to get. And a lot of that, I took a lot of those ideas and, when it was applicable, I would bring those into Garbage. The same with Sonic Youth, just looking at how they tune their guitars. There's things like that you see as an engineer and as a producer that you take with you, and you use them on another session when you can. When like I said, when it's applicable to what you're recording at the moment.
When recording a band, generally, do you like to do as live a take as possible, or do you generally kind of want to start with a basis with the drums and then build up, or a mixture of both?
It depends on the song and the artist. I guess typically, I would want them to record the song live, but really what I'm doing is focusing on making sure that we get a good drum track. If we get great bass and guitar and keyboard parts, that's great. You just keep them. But in the back of my head, I'm always like, well, we'll probably go back and redo those, and then I can really focus on getting the bass performance and the bass sound, and getting same with the guitars and the keyboards and vocals, whatever. But sometimes it's good to have the band track live just to make sure the feel is good, especially if you're starting with the drums as the main instrument that you're going to overdub things to. You want to make sure that the track feels really good. But I just finished producing a record for Silver Sun Pickups, their new album, Widow's Weeds, and we started doing some pre-production on very spare demos here at my home studio. And as we sort of worked on them, I had Brian O'Bear put down some rhythm guitars with acoustic guitar and electric guitar. And I realized that his feel sort of drives the feel of their songs. So when we went into the studio to start recording, that's how we recorded them. I referenced the demos that we made, and so I had tempos worked out to click tracks. In some cases, they were tempo map songs where the tempo speed up and slow down. So I'd come up with a click or some sort of percussion track, and then we tracked all the guitars first. We did all the acoustic and clean electric guitars. And then we did Nicky's bass, and then we did Joe's keys, and we did the drums last. And I think that the album feels really good. Like I said, I realized that Brian's playing sort of drives how the band performs, and the rest of the band really enjoyed playing to guitars that were finished. Rather than going and playing live and then everybody coming back and cutting them to the drums. I think even Christopher, the drummer, preferred playing his drums once he knew this is what I'm playing to. This is the sound of the guitar and this is the performance. So it was much easier for him to figure out all his parts and record them.
So I guess if you are focusing on that drum sound, just take obviously Nevermind, which has that famous drum sound in that great room, where the rest of the band in there with Dave kind of playing there with their amps in another room, or was it done differently?
Yeah, when we tracked Nevermind, we set Dave's drums up in the middle of the studio at Sound City, and then I brought in headphone boxes on either side of him for Kurt and Chris to play. But I ran their amps. I put Kurt's amp in the hallway to the left side of the studio right before you come into the control room, and then I put the bass, the MPEG bass, the SVT bass rig in a little ISO booth to the right of Dave's drums. So the amps were not in the room, and then I just cranked them up in the headphones so they could hear them, which was great because then it allowed me I could turn up the room mics on the drums. You don't have to worry about the bleed so much, and it worked great in that situation.
Have you ever done albums with bands all in the same room, kind of amps blaring into all the other mics?
I have, and there's a lot of good things about having bleed in tracks. I mean, it does sort of glue things together. You have to be a little more careful about how you're recording everything. Sometimes you have to build little ISO boxes around the guitars. And you tell them, okay, you can't crank it this hard. You can turn it up, but it can't be quite that loud. You have to listen back to everything and make sure that there's still going to be some control with the drums and the bass and the guitars and whatever instrumentation you have, that it's not going to all be crushed by one particular instrument. But then they also have to be aware that everybody has to play really good because we're going for takes where the sound is going to bleed into everything. So if you make mistakes, there's a chance that might be heard in the overhead mics of the drums, or vice versa. The drummer might play a bad fill and it might bleed through into a drum or into a guitar mic. So, but I think that's good for bands sometimes to do that. It keeps them on their toes. When they know they have to perform at their absolute top, it's that can make for exciting recordings.
And I know you mentioned the kind of ISO booths. Do you have any other techniques for working with bleed in situations like that?
Well, sometimes I would I would line the amps up, like if the drummer's in the middle of the room or in a corner of the room, and you've got a couple of guitar amps and a bass amp, I would line them all up right next to each other, sort of facing towards the drums, and then I put baffles between them, so to separate them. And then I would also put one baffle up between all three of the amps, between that and the drums. So if the guitarist wants to hear his guitar, he's kind of got his own little area he can get in. There's a baffle on the side of his amp that's keeping the bass and the other guitar amp out of his immediate vicinity. And I usually set the baffles high enough so if the guitar player is standing there, he can still look over the baffle and see the drummer play. But if the amp is on the floor, the basic sound of the amp is gonna be going straight into the baffle. And so when you do that, you have to make sure you go to a studio that actually has baffles like that. And any studio that records like that, they're usually going to have several different sized baffles, and if not, you can always make them. You get some thick plywood and you get some Sonex or whatever, just some styrofoam or any kind of foam, and you just glue it on there, and just to break down the bass is going to go through. You're not going to be able to keep the bass from bleeding through. If you're going to stop bass from bleeding, you need basically concrete or really thick walls. But it's going to cut all the high end and the mid range down, which is where there is a lot of information in guitars, and it'll for the most part it'll keep it out of the drum mics.
Have you ever done any albums kind of without headphones, using a PA or something similar?
I have. There's a band that I just worked on a box set for their earlier releases. It's a band I did at Smart years ago, Laughing Hyenas. They were assigned to Touch and Go, and they were a fierce, fierce band. They played sort of bluesy punk rock and had a very tribal, heavy feel. And they used to track live at Smart, and we would bring a PA in. And I didn't know this. The first session we ever did, they loaded all their gear, and then they loaded this PA, and I go, "What's that?" And they go, "We want to set up the PA too." And at first I was like, "Oh man, that's gonna suck. It's gonna be a pain in the butt." But it was cool. Like, I basically set them up and got all the tones, and once that was all good, then we set the PA up, and I ran the drums, like the kick and snare, and the toms into the PA, and some of the bass, and some of the guitar, and the vocals. And that was all recorded in the room with them when they were playing live. So it was intense. I mean, it was just a crazy, crazy sound. Very, pretty harsh because the PA could not handle all of the sound, so it was distorting. But then you would mix that in with with all the microphones from the regular kit and the bass and the guitar, and it gave it a real sound, and they loved it, and those records have a real unique sound to them.
Maybe you want to talk about acoustic guitar. Have you had any kind of standard techniques, favorite microphones for that over the years?
Well, I usually use condenser microphones, and I like smaller diaphragm condenser microphones. AKGs are great. They're real, like a 451 is an amazing, fairly prevalent microphone to use on an acoustic guitar. I love these B&K microphones, also condenser mics. I don't use dynamic mics. I don't think they somehow translate the percussive harmonic expressive finger picking very well. So, and the same with ribbon mics. I think they just sound too soft. So I find condenser mics to generally be the best for acoustic guitars. But a lot of that is deciding on what mic to use is listening to the guitarist play. I don't usually mic the open hole, the open F hole. I usually mic towards about the 12th fret, off the fret, so you're getting a little bit more of the harmonics coming off the guitar. And I like to use I usually compress the acoustic pretty quick, so it's kicking down. It's got a pretty quick attack and a pretty quick release. Like if you're using an 1176, they're not set to maximum attack and maximum release, but both set pretty quick. Because I like just to kick down a little bit of the strum, so you get a little bit of that zingy sound, but then it right away pushes up the sustain. And I've got 2 or 3 settings that I use here that I go into a studio, and they seem to always work pretty well on an acoustic, especially if it's a rhythmic part, a strummy part. If it's finger picking, whether you're using a pick or with your actual finger, then that's a whole different thing. You usually have to bring the gain up, and I might change the compression, and I might EQ it more. I might cut like low mids if I feel it's too boxy or upper bass. But it just depends on the part, the part that's being played.
Do you have any particular techniques for recording someone who's singing and playing acoustic at the same time?
Well, if someone's singing and playing acoustic, that can be tricky because you don't want to get phase anomalies. If you just put a mic up and listen to the singer singing that sounds good. And as soon as you bring up acoustic mic, because it's only, a couple feet away, sometimes there are weird phase anomalies, and you have to move one of the mics around. Usually, if I know where they're going to be singing, I'll just move the acoustic mic, and you have to keep moving it and just use your ear until you don't hear a phase anomaly. And there's no real easy way to do that except trial and error. You can't just flipping the phase isn't always going to do it, but you can really hear it. If someone's playing a guitar and you have both mics open and just with your hand just move the acoustic guitar around, you can hear any of the problems that are like what I call the phase anomalies that are happening.
Have you ever tried to do a project with just one microphone for both the acoustic and the vocal?
I have, and that actually can be great. It obviously has to capture both, so you have to find a place where that microphone sounds good. In that instance, I like to use large diaphragm condensers. I've got a couple U47s here. I also have a couple mics that are large diaphragm that I can put in omni mode, so I can just put it about 2 feet from the singer's voice down just to the point if they're going to stand up or sit on a stool where it's just above the guitar, and then you just listen to it. You go in the control room, and if you want a little bit more voice, you just move it a little bit closer to his or her, where they're singing. And if you want a little bit more guitar, you just drop it down a couple more inches at a time until you get the kind of balance you want. And I've done that a couple times here. I worked with an amazingly talented artist, Christopher, and called Never Shout Never, and we did some demos for his album here, and basically doing that, just putting up a U47, and he just stood in front of it and played the songs, and it sounded amazing. I was like, dude, we should put this out as a record. I mean, part of it said he's a really good singer and great player, so like he did everything in one take, and I was just like, wow, that sounds incredible. But that was the way to do it. Just put up one mic and move it till it's the balance sounded good between the voice and the guitar.
Have you ever had any projects where you deliberately kind of were as minimal as possible in terms of recording techniques? Yeah, and sometimes I had to do that in the past. I'd go to other studios, and much like Smart when we started, they didn't have a great setup. They didn't have a lot of channels on the board, or they didn't have a lot of microphones, and that can be liberating. Also, when we started out, we had an 8-track studio, so you have to learn just to use whatever you're using. The basic minimum has to work. There's no point in putting up 40 microphones if you're only going to record to 8 tracks. It's like less is more in some ways, and it depends on the project, though, and the band. But in general, I think the simpler you can keep your setup, the better you're going to be. The less phase issues you have to deal with, just cable issues and all the different level issues and things like that. It's the simpler you can keep it, the better when you can do it that way. Yeah. I guess moving on to talk about bass now. Have you had any favorite mics and techniques over the years?
Well, I usually run a DI from the bass, and I also like to mic it with sometimes a combination of mics on the amp. It depends on what the amp is you're using. Like I love Ampeg SVTs. They're just for rock. They're amazing. And sometimes I'll take the DI, which will be straight out of the bass into the DI, and sometimes I'll take the DI from the head. A lot of heads have DI outputs, so you get the sound of the DI also gets the amp EQ and overdrive. It just depends on what the song is like, but I like to use large diaphragm mics, condenser mics on bass. Like I'll use a U47 or a U67. Sometimes I'll use a Fat 47, which is a softer sounding mic. It's not a condenser; it's a FET mic, and they're thicker sounding. But I don't use dynamic mics. When I have used a dynamic mic, I've sometimes used a Shure SM7, which is a great mic, by the way. If you had to take one mic to a desert island that you could use on everything, that's probably the mic I would take, a SM7. I've used it on kick drum. Yeah, I've used it on kick drum. I've used it on guitars. I've used it on vocals. That's what Billy Corgan sang into on Siamese Dream. That was my Shure SM7. So it's a good mic, and I'll use it on bass every now and then. But in general, I like to use large diaphragm condensers on the amp.
What kind of a distance are you normally putting the condensers?
You don't want them too close to the amp because in order for the bass to develop, you have to get back so the sine waves can kind of hit their peaks. When the bass player starts playing, I'll usually go into the room and cover my ears because you can feel the bass. You don't have to stick your ear into the cabin, especially if it's really loud. And I would say probably in the 2.5 to 4 foot range. And if you want to get, if I'm double miking it, and you want to get more of the growl, like if it's a cabinet that has like a horn in the top or a smaller drivers in the top and then a big, like a 15-inch on the bottom, I'll mic that. Like I might put a Shure SM7 on the top and get that closer to the smaller speakers so I can get more of the upper mid-range and the top end if you want to hear more definition. Then I'll blend those two together. You have to make sure that those are also the phase is good, because anytime you start playing with the bass like that and moving the far mic back to get the bass, they can very quickly get out of phase. So, and then I always record those onto separate tracks. So I'll put the DI on one track and put the amp sound onto, whether it's one or two mics. If it's two mics, I'll blend those together and put those on a separate track.
With the SM7, have you had any particularly kind of favorite preamps with it, vocals especially?
The SM7 has low gain compared to a lot of mics, so you're going to need to turn the preamp up. I have a tendency to use that into either Chandler preamps, which are very much like Neve style preamps, or APIs. Like I love API preamps. They're great on vocals and great on guitars. If the SM7, I think sounds very good in like API 512s. Let me look and see what I have right in front of me here. Now, what have I got? I've got my lunchbox is a I'm using a 512B preamp and a 550 EQ. So I'm using a 512B preamp and a 550 EQ, and that's a really go-to preamp EQ for me. Whether it's using a SM7 or anything, at least in my studio here, that's one of my main gain stages that I use. Let me also, since I'm sitting right here, my vocal chain here is it goes through a Chandler LTD1, which is again very much style like a Neve 1073. And one of my go-to vocal compressors that I've used for 20 plus years is a Summit TLA 100. And I'm recording with it right now. And as I talk, it kicks down 10 dB. Like I'm not shy with the compression. There's something about the way the compression sounds in that particular compressor that's really soft and musical. I've used that on the Foo Fighters and Green Day and Garbage and Soul Asylum and Against Me and Billy Corgan. It's like that. That's my go-to vocal compressor, a TLA 100. It doesn't always work on drums. In fact, I rarely use it on drums, and I rarely use it on guitars. But when it comes to vocals, that's my favorite vocal compressor.
I think I read on Nevermind that you used a U67 going into 1176 and LA2A. Is that right?
I think so. That's what they had at Sound City. Sound City did not have a lot of outboard gear, but they had a LA2A and they had 1176. And the 1176 you can set to a faster attack and faster release for quicker consonants. And then the LA2A is obviously thicker, but it's got a slower attack and slower release. And so you get the balance on both those. So it can catch the quick elements of a vocal, but then it also just, the LA2A softens it out.
So I guess moving on with vocals, is it normally either a kind of tube condenser mic or something like an SM7?
Yeah, I'll use pretty much any mic if a singer wants to use that. A lot of times I find that singers like to sing in specific microphones because they're used to the tonal balance, and they can sort of hear it in headphones, how their voice is sounding. And how people hear themselves in their heads is quite unique. How I hear someone's voice is completely different than how the singer hears it. And it's important for me as a producer to make sure they're comfortable in hearing when they're recording, they're getting an accurate sense of how they're sounding, if that makes any sense. So if they want to sing in an SM57, that's okay with me. Of course, I'd rather use a tube mic like a U47, or I also have a 50s, a late 1950s ELA M250, ELA M250, and it's incredible sounding. It just has this kind of saturation in the top end that's it's hard to describe, but it sounds incredible. But I don't always use that. I'll use whatever's handy in a studio. Actually, we at the studio where we do a lot of the garbage work. There's a studio in Atwater, just a few blocks from my house here, called Red Razor, and our engineer Billy Bush owns that studio, and we do a lot of garbage recording there. And he's got a couple great mics that we use a lot. He's got a Bronner mic, which sounds amazing. And he recently bought an old vintage M49, which has this great mid-range tone to it. It almost sort of sounds like a ribbon mic, but it has a very pronounced bump somewhere between like 800 hertz and 2K, but it's a pleasant bump, and it's really interesting sounding. It just doesn't sound like any other condenser mic, and those mics are hard to find. I'm glad he tracked one down somewhere because we've been using that a lot on vocalists at the studio. But here at my home studio, I use a U47. I've got my ELAM here, which sounds great. I've got some ribbon mics. I've got some 57s and Shure 58s, which people like to use, and that's between those, that's usually gonna handle it here.
For getting people comfortable with kind of how they sound, do you have any tips for headphone mixes that have kind of worked over the years in terms of getting people happy?
Well, I don't like to make the vocals too wet. I find that masks what they're doing. If a singer asks for a delay or reverb, I'll put a little bit in there, but I'll usually put the headphones on and listen to what they're hearing, because I want them to hear themselves fairly dry, just so they can hear their timing and hear their, the vibe they're going for. Obviously, sometimes you want a little bit of reverb or delay just because it's more fun to sing. And then I usually will check their mix too, so it's not too loud. Some singers, they turn their voice up so loud, and I understand that they want to hear very clearly what they're doing, but I also want them to be aware that they need to hear the track, to lock in with their phrasing and to make sure that their pitch is good. So I usually check the mixes, and you'd be surprised, especially if you're sending a multi-channel mix to someone, where it's a little, they can do their own mix, and the drums are on tracks, and the bass is on one, the guitars on one, the vocals, and I'll go and listen to it, and the mix sometimes sounds terrible. It doesn't sound anything at all like the mix that I'm listening to. So I'll spend a minute and go through and mix it for them, and then say, how does this sound? And usually they go, oh, that sounds great. Thanks for doing that. And that helps a lot. I'm also, when I get a chain to record and I have a setting that I know is working for them in terms of their headphone mix, I'm very careful to use that chain every time they do a new vocal. So the way they're hearing their vocal is the same in terms of EQ level compared to the band, Because if I call up another track and it's not set the same, if it's too low, they're going to sing harder. If it's too loud, they're going to sing softer. So once I know I'm getting good performances, I'm very, very keen on making sure that all the way, even if we go to another song, I want to make sure that's exact same chain, because I know that's where where the levels are good for them and I'm getting great performances, and I don't want to vary from that because I don't want to throw off their dynamic, basically.
I think the last instrument we haven't covered is piano. Do you have any techniques for that over the years, and kind of favourite mics? I mean, upright and grand, and anything really.
Well, piano is a complicated beast because it's so incredible in terms of the harmonics and the tones that it generates. And I usually like to, whether it's an upright or a grand, I like to lift the lid. And sometimes I'll record a couple pair of mics, and I'll put two very close to right over where the person is playing, like an XY pattern. So it's the left mic is aimed a little bit more towards the lower side of the keyboard, and probably a condenser mic like a 414 or a B&K or I might use a 451. But I like to use condensers there. And then I'm inside the piano. I'll usually put up a couple mics too, and I generally like to use a bigger diaphragm condensers. Again, like a U47 or a ELAM 250s or 251s sound incredible on pianos. And depending on the part, if it's a nice sounding room, sometimes I like to put up a stereo mic like a AKG C24 back about maybe 10 or 15 feet, sort of more from an audience perspective, and then be able to bring that up in the mix if you want to have the piano sound a little bit more ambient. I generally don't like to EQ pianos when I record them, but I will compress them. I'll put a little bit of limiting on the close mics and on the room mic just to just sort of contain any of the dynamics a little bit if suddenly the piano player gets really hot. But I don't really like to EQ until a track is recorded. When it gets to a mix, I might EQ it. I might cut some mids or low mids, or I might boost top end if it needs to compete with guitars and drums and bass and things like that. But I like to leave the piano EQ-wise as au naturel as possible until the very end of the mix, when I might change the sound on it to fit in with whatever's going on in the arrangement.
I think that's all my questions, Butch. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
All right, cool, Hamish.